Hey everyone, my name is Shelby Hartman. I'm DoubleBlind's co-founder and editor-in-chief, and today we're going to talk about golden teachers. So if you've tripped on mushrooms before, and you bought those mushrooms from a guy that knows a guy, you probably purchased Psilocybe cubensis. And if you're anything like I was in college, you probably didn't ask what kind of shrooms they were because you're like, you just want shrooms. And shrooms are shrooms, right? But, you know, as the psychedelic industry, quote unquote, grows, people are becoming a lot more curious about different kinds of psilocybin-containing mushrooms, and they want to gain, and are gaining, a more sophisticated understanding of the difference between the different varieties and strains and cultivars of shrooms, and we'll get into all of that in this video. So before we get into all of this, I just want to provide a little bit of a disclaimer, which is that we're seeing a lot of what happened in the cannabis industry before it grew happen in the realm of shrooms as well, which is that it used to just be weed in a mason jar. And then it became like sativa and indica, and then it became about, you know, oh, you gotta try this new strain of OG purple cloud elephant. I'm being a bit facetious here, but the point is that, you know, you really have to be critical about, is this marketing or is this real? So the first thing that we need to talk about is the difference between a species, strain, and cultivar. These terms, also like variety and isolate, get thrown around a lot interchangeably by vendors and people who don't really know what they're talking about. So let's start with the thing that's easiest to understand, which is a species. Species are distinct genetic lineages that usually cannot interbreed. So think humans. Homo sapiens are a species that are distinct from Homo erectus, an early hominid that came before Homo sapiens. So there are exceptions to the interbreeding rule that give us hybrids, like you might have heard about the liger, which is a lion and a tiger, or the mule, which is a horse and a donkey. But we don't usually see interbreeding between species, and at least at DoubleBlind, we don't know of any hybrids of psychedelic mushroom species. So most of our current understanding of the difference between species are related to their specific genetic composition, which is determined in the lab and used to make comparisons between how similar species are genetically. However, even at the species level, there's still a lot to learn about genetics and potency, with reclassifications of species names or conflicting reports on alkaloid content. So oftentimes when we talk about psychedelic mushrooms, we talk about psilocybin, which people think of as the primary compound that makes you trip. But psychedelic mushrooms and different species of psychedelic mushrooms have many different alkaloids that all work synergistically together. So let's get into some practicalities that might help you make a decision as a consumer, whether you're purchasing shrooms or you're purchasing spores and you're thinking about growing shrooms. The first thing that you want to look at is the Latin name, which will usually be, as mentioned before, Psilocybe cubensis, because that is the most commonly cultivated magic mushroom. And if you're looking at golden teachers, you're looking at B+, you're looking at penis envy, these are all types of Psilocybe cubensis. So for the Latin naming system, you guys might remember this from elementary school. The format goes genus, Psilocybe, followed by the species, cubensis. So if you're looking at spores and the Latin names are different, then you know you have separate species. Remember, just as you could never cross a fly with a human, you could not naturally cross Psilocybe cubensis with Psilocybe mexicana. Though if you manage to prove us wrong, please let us and the rest of the scientific community know immediately. So now let's move beyond species to strains and varieties. Scientists argue over the difference between a strain and a variety, and it's not very helpful that each discipline of biology has their own preferred definitions of these things. And on top of that, as mentioned before, you have vendors that are really into marketing that are just adding confusion to all of this by straight up inventing new strains and cultivars without properly explaining why they're distinct. Generally speaking though, strains should all originate from the same species. Again, usually Psilocybe cubensis. And strains can actually be interbred freely, and that's how new strains are created. So a good example of the deliberate interbreeding of strains would be Penis envy and B+, both Psilocybe cubensis strains, which gave rise to the tidal wave strain, which was noted for winning the April 2021 Oakland Hyphae Psilocybin Cup. Deliberate interbreeding of strains by skilled growers can give rise to albino and sporeless versions of Psilocybe cubensis and other mutations, but it's important to point out that a truly distinct strain should display stable characteristics that can be reproduced in every grow project. So just because you decide to grow mushrooms and a mushroom pops up out of your substrate that is funky looking and doesn't look anything like a mushroom that you have seen before does not necessarily mean that you have isolated a new strain. You have to be able to prove that you can grow the same characteristics repeatedly. That's why strains can only really be maintained through cloning, which is something that we teach people how to do in our intermediate mushroom growing course. Once you take the spores from a mushroom and grow these up, you shake up the bag of genetics in the mycelium. What you pull out may no longer be identical to the parent mushroom it came from. Let's talk about cultivars, short for cultivated variety. Rather than being a genetically identical clone, these are usually grown from spores. As each individual spore contains a random mix of half the parent mushroom's genetic material, any mycelium produced from the spores of a defined strain will develop their own distinct genetic characteristics. Repeat this process enough times, taking spores from each successful grow in turn, and your mushroom genetics can drift away far enough that the defined characteristics of the original strain may end up being lost. And that isn't always a bad thing. It can give rise to new and interesting mutations when you feel like growing mushrooms is getting boring. It's possible to stabilize cultivars through multiple rounds of selective breeding by taking spores from each generation and deliberately selecting for specific characteristics such as growth rate, substrate preference, and with enough testing, even potency. So let's talk about the difference between penis envy and golden teacher mushrooms, because these are two of the most common varieties of Psilocybe cubensis that you'll likely encounter if you're buying shrooms or if you're thinking about growing them at home. So there are a few things to consider from both a cultivation and dosage perspective. You've probably heard, if you are trying to learn more about different varieties of mushrooms, that penis envy are really strong, and when you take penis envy you're going to have a really intense trip and the visuals are going to be really intense, and that has been my experience. But also it's important to note that there is just a ton of variation in the potency of both varieties, and the variations are due to differences in growing conditions, how the mushrooms have been handled after they've been harvested. So generally speaking, you can't just grow a variety of Psilocybe cubensis or buy a variety and just assume that the potency is going to be stronger than the potency of another variety just based on kind of like the legend and lore of this particular mushroom. Really the best thing, as always with tripping, is start low and go slow, right? You can always, at the risk of stating the obvious, you can always take more, but you can't take less. There are psilocybin potency test kits, and we've written about them on DoubleBlind's website, but they're not that common and they're not super accessible, so best to just familiarize yourself with whatever mushrooms you have by taking a little bit and seeing how they make you feel. From a cultivation perspective, both penis envy and golden teachers, again, are derived from Psilocybe cubensis, so that means that the growing conditions are very similar. Some have reported longer colonization times when growing penis envy. Others have found they grow just as quickly as any other variety, but the difference is not significant. I mean, from kind of inoculation all the way to harvesting, it's like usually 90 days at the most. Differences in growing time can be down to the genetics within each variety, as well as the differences in growing conditions. So there's just a lot of different things to consider. But at the end of the day, just choose the variety you want to choose. Don't worry so much about that. If you're going with Psilocybe cubensis, it's pretty straightforward, and the growing conditions are similar. So the biggest difference between penis envy and golden teachers, or one of the biggest differences, might simply be how they look. So golden teachers look a lot more like the Psilocybe cubensis mushrooms that you might find growing in the wild. They have golden caps. They're usually largish golden caps. Penis envy, on the other hand, has been subject to decades of selective breeding and looks a lot different than mushrooms that you might find in the wild. So you can think of the difference between a purebred French bulldog and a wolf. One of the side effects of this is that penis envy produces far fewer spores from its tiny gills, which can make taking spore prints more difficult. And by contrast, golden teachers will happily dump a thick carpet of purple-black spores, making it a good choice for people who want to make spore prints, which again, we teach people how to do in our intermediate mushroom growing course. Let's also talk about the difference between B+ and golden teacher, because B+ is also a really common variety of Psilocybe cubensis that you might have encountered. And again, they share a lot of similarities across a range of characteristics, growth conditions, growth requirements, potency, pretty similar. Both varieties have a long and mostly forgotten history, likely going back further in time than the online fungal cultivation forums like Shroomery that you are probably familiar with and emerged in the late 90s, early 2000s, along with just about everything else on the internet other than Facebook. So although B+ was once rumored to be a crossbreed of Psilocybe cubensis and the wood-loving Psilocybe azurensis, which we talk about on our website, it's now considered a myth due to the low genetic likelihood of getting these two different species to interbreed. Again, we're not aware of any, psilocybin-containing mushroom species that have interbred. So due to how long they've been cultivated for, how widespread they're cultivated, both golden teachers and B+ are highly recommended for new growers looking for a starter variety. It's possible, though, that this is just simply because of how long their spores have been in circulation within the growing community. So both species grow well on grain-based starter substrates, as well as bulk substrates, such as core and manure. We cover all of this in our beginner mushroom growing course. And as most growers start with spores, there can be a fair amount of variation in appearance of golden teachers and B+, which can sometimes overlap to the point that even really experienced growers cannot tell them apart, unlike with penis envy. One exception to this is the recent surge in a B+ mutation that causes the mushrooms to grow little hats, which are fuzzy outgrowths of mycelium on the cap. And if these appear in your grow, there's nothing to worry about. They're completely harmless. Let's talk about potency. Although breeding unique growth characteristics into your mushrooms might look pretty, what most mushroom experts tend to be interested in is, how strong are these things? How intense is my trip gonna be? I wanna blast off into another dimension. What's the strongest variety out there? It's important to point out here again that genetic characteristics tend to be independent of each other. So while some growers might tell you, oh yeah, these albino penis envy, they're so strong, you're just, you're gonna lose your ego and you're gonna see God. There's actually not any evidence that that is true. Sorry. So when it comes to species, we know very little about differences in potency, concentration of psilocybin, but also, as mentioned before, all the other alkaloids that are in all of these different kinds of mushrooms that we don't usually talk about within the psychedelic community. We have very little scientific evidence that is telling us about the difference between these varying kinds of psilocybin-containing mushrooms. We need more research. There's been a slight uptick in sort of the insights that we have recently, thanks to, what I was talking about before, the psilocybin cup. And we can say with a fairly high degree of certainty that Psilocybe azurensis is one of the most potent naturally occurring species that is currently known. And also, scientific data has compared wild and cultivated species and shown that some potency can vary by a factor of 4 and 10 respectively. And until recently, as mentioned, very little was known about the potency between the strains. Many growers and trippers in the vaults of Erowid and Shroomery would be like, oh yeah, penis envy, it's so strong, one of the most potent strains. And actually that was just from citizen science, anecdotal self-experimentation, which at DoubleBlind, we don't disregard. We think there's value in people having experiences and describing them, but there just wasn't any rigorous scientific data that was backing that stuff up. And then in April of 2021, we had the first Psilocybin Cup, which was a community-led science project which quantified psilocybin and psilocin in over 60 strains supplied by growers. So the findings are relatively preliminary, but their methods were strong and they added important data to back up all of these anecdotal potency claims. Across all the strains submitted, psilocybin content ranged from as low as 0.14% up to 2.26% dry weight in the winning tidal wave strain, which was grown by Magic Myco. Enough samples were submitted that some general potency trends between strains have started to emerge. So now what you've all been waiting for, the potency of golden teachers, which, at least according to this preliminary data, is similar to most other varieties of Psilocybe cubensis, which was around 0.6 to 0.7% psilocybin by dry weight. A noticeable dose where you start to feel some psychedelic effects begins around 1 gram dried, and we talk about this in a lot of our other videos and articles on how to take shrooms. A lot of people advocate for larger doses, which is 2, 3.5 grams. Probably would not recommend you start at anything above 3.5 grams if you're new to mushrooms, because you might find it overwhelming. And as mentioned before, one of the biggest problems with mushroom strains is just that, a lot like cannabis, you don't always know that you're getting what you paid for. So just because there have been some trends that were identified in the psilocybin cup doesn't mean that when you go and you buy mushrooms and they say, oh yeah, these are albino penis envy, or these are tidal wave, or these are golden teachers, or whatever they say they are, that's what they really are. A strain is just, it's a bit of a fuzzy concept, and there's no way to really guarantee that your golden teachers aren't actually Mazatepec or B+, or, really, it could be a variety of things. The only strain that, is easier to identify, as mentioned, is really penis envy, just because it looks so unique and it's so different from a lot of the varieties that you might find growing in the wild. That's why you really can't shop for potency, and it's often helpful to just pick based on a feeling rather than scouring the internet and worrying endlessly if you're making the right choice. Just buy something that looks interesting and grow it, or if they're already grown, take a little bit and just experiment and take notes and see how it makes you feel. If you're a more experienced grower, you can try other species like Psilocybe mexicana, Panaelous cyanescens, any of the other wood-loving psilocybes, which are harder to grow than dung-loving species like golden teachers and penis envy. And just keep in mind that if you're shopping off the Psilocybe cubensis menu, that more exotic species might be harder to find. And also, again, you run into unscrupulous vendors telling you that you're getting something that you're not getting because they're making a mistake or they're trying to mislead you. It's hard to say. So that's why, when you're shopping for anything else on the internet or not on the internet, you need to look at reviews and support vendors that are trusted, and ideally a vendor that has sold to someone that you know who had a good experience with the spores. In conclusion, golden teachers do exist, but with most things, in the mushroom world, once you scratch the surface, you realize that there's just a lot more to understand than is it or is it not a golden teacher mushroom. And I'll say that, as is the case in the worlds of cannabis and psychedelics more broadly, there's kind of a debate or a war or a tension, I don't know what the right word is, but between scientific data or the lack of it and all of these anecdotal reports that you'll find on the internet. And so I can tell you personally that, like, I've tripped on penis envy mushrooms, I've tripped on different types of penis envy mushrooms, and I've also tripped on golden teachers. And my experience was that the golden teachers were really gentle and euphoric, and that penis envy were a bit more like cerebral and twisted and dark, and I definitely had a much stronger experience when I did the same amount of penis envy as golden teachers. But there's so many things to consider. And we talk about this a lot on the DoubleBlind website and in our webinars and in our courses, but the reality is that every single trip is different, every single person is different. Even two mushrooms that are growing next to one another in the same bin are different. So yeah, you gotta go into these experiences knowing that it is about trial and error and about being responsible and going slow and taking notes on, how these different things make you feel. So if you're looking for more information about psychedelics or growing mushrooms, you can check us out at doubleblindmag.com.